Oh, okay. So this morning we're going to examine the Christologies of Mark and Luke. Last week, when we were looking at early Jewish Christology, I wanted to get to the Philippians text, and I didn't even get to the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so I will have some closing comments to make about the Gospel of Matthew, but I particularly want to look at Mark today, big time, Luke, a lesser amount, and Matthew an even lesser amount. What we've been examining for now months are a number of disciplines in theology and biblical studies through a very specific lens. And this lens is twofold. Theologically, that lens comes from Karl Barth. And I have specifically chosen Barth because I think he supplies a real important solution when it comes to how we do our theological thinking as a Trinitarian hermeneutic. That is, the doctrine of the Trinity before anything else is a hermeneutic. It allows us to understand how the Father is revealed in the Son by the Spirit. That's the whole point of the doctrine of the Trinity. And then, unfortunately, it slips that position almost immediately, and the doctrine of the Trinity becomes something to be worshipped or adored. Are you with me on this? Okay. And basically, that's what we've turned the doctrine of the Trinity into in our modern era, with all of our lovely new Trinitarian thinkers out there who encourage us to sit and just meditate on God's inter-Trinitarian relationships. That's fundamentally Gnostic. Okay? Yes, the Father loves the Son. We can see that in the drama, the narrative, the story of Jesus. Okay? But to sit and think about some eternal little love thing going on between the Father and the Son and the Spirit is absolutely useless, because it never translates into real reality for people. And you'll see that the same people today that do so-called Trinitarian thinking, their ethics don't reflect that, nor does their ecclesiology reflect that. And so if Trinitarian thinking isn't permeating and affecting every single doctrine that you have, then you are going to end up where we are at today. And by choosing Karl Barth, essentially what I'm saying is there is now a starting point, and that starting point is trust. And we spent the entire first month just unpacking trust, even in a way Barth never did. The second part of the lens, like I have two lenses on my glasses, is of course René Girard. And because Barth does not supply us with an anthropology. I mean, he does in the Church Dogmatics, he has an anthropology, but for my money, it's a very weak anthropology. Girard provides us with a much more realistic approach to anthropology. And so at this point, I've got my theological lens, which is Barth, my anthropological lens, which is Girard, and the engagement of the two is the engagement of science and religion, or science and the Christian faith tradition. The reason I chose the Karl Barth was because of the distinction he makes very clearly in his epistle to the Romans and all of his early essays between religion and revelation, and how he identifies religion with the Christian religion. In his epistle to the Romans, anytime the law is mentioned in chapter 7, Barth turns that into this liberal Christian tradition and just proceeds to show how Paul decimates it. And that's a very important insight, the distinction between religion and revelation. Well, Girard, as you know, has made that distinction much more focused by actually getting in and generating a theory of religion. And that theory of religion is an anthropology. It basically says religion comes from humans. We are the ones who created the concept of gods. Listen very carefully. We humans created the category of religion or theology. That's something we did. And when we did it, from the very beginning, because the victim is the first binary symbol, demonized and divinized. We created Janus-faced gods. And that's what's been with us throughout religious history of the human species. And we've seen in a number of different ways, historically, theologically, in terms of exegesis, how the New Testament itself is a great big dialogue between Jesus, religion, and revelation. And we've seen how some New Testament writers are slotting Jesus back into a second temple kind of thinking with a very dark eschatology. We've also seen how others are showing this nonviolent God, this nonviolent approach that God has to the human species. So what we've done is we've now have two categories, religion and revelation, but we've also talked about these two categories as law and gospel. We're going to add a third category today, later on. What I'm trying to help you see through all of this is that it's not that there's a tension in the New Testament. It's that there is a very, very clear argument going on in the New Testament, and somebody has to win. And inevitably, throughout the history of Christendom, the winner of that argument has been the James Peter tradition. It has been the tradition which reorients the Christian tradition to law. And every once in a while, there will be this burst of a figure who comes along and says, it's not about law, it's about grace. One of those was Augustine, who saw very clearly that the human being contributed absolutely nothing to their salvation. And of course, it's his rediscovery of Paul at that point. And again, at the time of the Reformation, with Luther, and Luther's insistence that there must be a merciful God, that this God that he lived with, this Janus-faced God, he just couldn't endure it. And he had to have a merciful God. And then in the 20th century, again, with the rediscovery of Paul by Barth in particular, and then, of course, the new perspective on Paul, and now, most fortunately for us in our lifetime, this apocalyptic rendering of Paul that we find in the work of Doug Campbell and Chris Tilling and others. So as we look at each of these gospels, we are asking a singular question. How do these texts inform us with regards to this argument between religion and revelation? So first, with the Gospel of Mark. There is one book, it was published at the turn of the 20th century, and every single scholar that has written on Mark has had to come to terms with this book. Now, I don't know if you've ever wondered this, but when you read the Gospel of Mark, and really only Mark, have you ever wondered why whenever somebody or some demon or something says, hey, you're the Son of God, or you're the Messiah, we know who you are, Jesus says, shh, be quiet. He silences them. You ever wondered about that? But Jesus does a miracle in Mark, and it's, shh, don't tell anybody, but they do anyway. But he says, don't tell anybody. This is known as the Messianic Secret, and this is the book by Vreda. Now, you don't have to buy it and read it, okay? I mean, if you're ever going to get into Markan studies, then you'd have to read this book and really come to terms with it. But Vreda's thesis at the turn of the century asks essentially three different questions. Number one, is Mark's Messianic secret construct, that is, where Jesus says, be quiet about his messiahship and be quiet about his miracles, did Mark create that? Because we don't find it in the other Gospels. Did Mark create the Messianic secret? That is, and if he did so, why? How are we to understand the fact that Jesus was rejected in his lifetime? And so the Messianic secret could function in Mark as an apology, as a way of saying they just didn't see, they were constantly misunderstanding, and so Jesus had to say, be quiet. Or is the Messianic secret, in fact, part of Jesus' own, that is the historical Jesus, which we'll be talking about all next month, is this part of Jesus' own self-awareness and self-consciousness. That is Jesus himself choosing to tell people to be silent about his messiahship and silent about his miracles? And if so, why? So, and when we look at the Gospel of Mark, and we have this theme of shutting down this messianic awareness, I think we have to take into consideration two different things. One, there is no doubt that the messianic awareness of the populace, whether historically, that is with reference to the historical Jesus, or even textually, as though Mark made the whole thing up, which he didn't. Either way, we have to come to terms with the fact that Jesus himself, there's a, how do I want to frame this? There's a distinction to be made between the messianic shutdown and the miracle shutdown. They belong together, but there's different reasons, I think, for each of those. We know that in the Gospel of Mark, all of this messianic secret goes up until the time of the transfiguration in chapter 9. And then after the time of the event of the transfiguration, that messianic secret disappears. Jesus is right in Jerusalem. He's out in the open. And that consciousness will be tested at the trial. Excuse me, I gotta let someone in. That consciousness where the high priest says, are you the Son of God? So first, with regard to messianic consciousness, I have no doubt that you can go to the gospel tradition and make an excellent case that Jesus understood himself to be an agent of God. Now, how did Jesus choose to frame that agency? Did Jesus come out and say, there's this Messiah category you guys have, and hey, that's me? And the answer is no, he did not do that. Jesus did not do that. Is it possible that for Jesus, this category of Messiah was not the right category by which to understand his mission and message? And if so, what is this category of Messiah? What does it mean to be Ho Christos? What does it mean to be this HaMashiach figure? Because if you've read the Jesus-driven life in chapter 2, you already know that Judaism did not have a single messianic doctrine. That's not as though there was a concept of Messiah, everybody held it. No. Different groups held different understandings of who Messiah was. Some groups didn't have a Messiah at all in their thinking. Some groups had two. Messiah from Aaron, Messiah from David, like the Essenes. There's no one singular messianic concept in Jesus Judaism, okay, that everybody believed. Second, there's no Messiah in the Old Testament. There is no single doctrine of Messiah that you can derive from the Jewish scriptures. There are promises that are made. Genesis 3 has the first promise: I will bring a redeemer, and he will crush the enemy's head, and the enemy will bruise his foot. We have different promises, but what we do not have is a messianic figure. That's something Christianity has learned to read back into the Jewish scriptures, and that's something that Judaism has rejected as part of their tradition, and I think, in that sense, rightly so. Jesus was not a messianic figure in the way the people understood messiahship. For those in Jesus' day, if they held to a messianic figure of any sort, this figure was a son of David type figure, a messianic warrior. We see this again in the Qumran literature. We see it in Josephus. And we can see it in like the Psalms of Solomon, which are Pharisaic literature written, say, 100 years before Jesus. We do see this this coming figure who brings all kinds of apocalyptic judgment. Again, the Book of Enoch is another example. Second Temple Judaism had as part of its eschatological framework that there would come a time God would judge the Gentiles and raise Israel. And then in addition to that, there were some groups that held one of God's agents, that is Messiah or the Archangel Michael, would come and be the agent of that judgment. We see that kind of logic reflected in the book of Revelation. In Mark, what we're looking at is something really radically different. And so the two times that Jesus shuts down the messianic question are at Caesarea Philippi and after the transfiguration event. At Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus queries his followers, who do people say I am? They offer a list of prophets, and then they say, some suggest you're John the Baptist raised from the dead. But in every single case, they're looking at Jesus as a prophet or a figure of judgment. When Simon Peter says, we know who you are the Messiah, immediately Jesus shuts that conversation down, and we know right away that Jesus says, okay, if you think I'm the Messiah, here's what's going to happen to me. I'm going to be crucified, you take before the elders and religious authorities, tortured, crucified. God will raise me on the third day. At which point Peter says, oh no, that's not how we understand messiahship. That's not what's going to happen to you. And Jesus has to say, get behind me, Satan. Because for Peter, for the disciples, for the crowds, for Jesus to be Messiah meant precisely that he was going to be this vindictive warrior agent on behalf of God. And Jesus has to shut down that logic, because that's not who he is. Now, after the resurrection, in the early church, as the early church is reflecting upon this whole event that we call the life of Christ and his death and his resurrection and ascension, this whole event, they will eventually begin going, but Jesus himself saw himself in the Jewish scriptures, in particular, 2nd Isaiah. That is, Jesus' self-consciousness of his mission comes from the book of 2nd Isaiah in particular. And they'll begin to develop other links to Isaiah. And then they develop this promise fulfillment scheme. And we see this really early on, quite early on in the book of Acts, in the preaching of the book of Acts, where that which was prophesied has come true. But in no instance do any of these sermons, when they talk about Jesus' messiahship, equate him with a vindictive warrior Messiah. It's an entirely different operation that Jesus undertakes as an agent of God. With this business of the Messianic secret, I want to read to you a section from Martin Hengel's book, Studies in the Gospel of Mark. He says, the tradition was aware of Jesus' messianic claim, the reality of which should not be doubted. We have no indication whatsoever from the history of tradition that the status of Messiah in Judaism was connected in any way with the resurrection of a righteous man or a prophet from the dead. Therefore, it's hard to derive the messianic status of Jesus simply from the resurrection appearances, which is what the early church did. See, Jesus was vindicated. Therefore, he is now God's Messiah. Hengel continues, appearances of the dead in a transfigured form and messianic status are two completely different things. Christology cannot be derived solely from the resurrection event, no matter how it is interpreted. The root of all Christology must be sought in Jesus' conduct and execution. By the way, for Steve Crosby, that's got to be gold right there. What Hengel's arguing is we do not need to see the messianic secret in Mark as a construct of Mark. We can see it as being traced back to the historical Jesus, but if we're going to do so, we have to know why Jesus rejected messiahship. And this can only be done from the perspective of the issue of violence and nonviolence, and for no other reason at all. Now, having said that, we have to ask, well, how are we today to understand what's going on with this business of Jesus as a messianic figure? And this is what the Gospel of Mark is now trying to do. But before we move and start looking at some text in the Gospel of Mark, the first thing we want to observe is that when you open your Gospel of Mark up to chapter 1, and you start reading in chapter 1, and Jesus comes on the scene, he gets baptized, he's tempted, first 13 verses, he begins preaching. And as you move through chapter 1, you will note that Jesus, as soon as he's surrounded by crowds, gets away into the wilderness. That's the first thing he does. He abhors these crowds. He gets away into the wilderness. The second thing he does, as you move into chapters 2 and 3, is he comes into conflict with everything and everybody. Pharisees, demons, crowds, you name it. It's one conflict story after another. And so, as we'll see a little bit later, one of the things that Mark is setting us up to understand is that the life of Jesus is a story about conflict. The life of Jesus is not a happy, clappy story. God sent his son and Jesus was really nice and healed people and cast out a few demons, and then he got crucified kind of almost by accident because he was such a nice guy. That's not the Christology of Mark. The Christology of Mark is that when revelation enters the sphere of religion, there is conflict. Period. And it's not for nothing that some of the scholars we'll look at in a moment will see this conflict in Mark written all over the place in three particular ways. So in order to kind of get a handle on Mark, I want to take a clue from Jack Kingsbury's book on the Christology of Mark. This is important. He says, the question has been put, that was put to Mark, is who is Jesus? And the answer which has been obtained is categorical. He's the Davidic Messiah King, the Son of God. Davidic Messiah King. And we find all of that in Mark. Mark's Christology is then royal in character. And the major titles it claims for Jesus are Messiah, Son of David, King of the Jews, or King of Israel, and Son of God. Now, this is what's key. This is Kingsbury. These titles, while they are related and to some extent overlap one another in meanings, are by no means equivalent terms. Mark draws distinctions among them which the reader dare not ignore. Easily, the sharpest distinction is that which places the title Son of God on a different level from that of the first three titles: King, Messiah, Son of David. Son of God is the preeminent title for Jesus for the writer of the Gospel of Mark. It is the filial relationship of the Son to the Father, from the baptism all the way to the cross, that is at the heart of Mark's understanding of who Jesus is. And we saw this last week in early Jewish Christianity. The trust that the Father had revealed the Father's self in the Son so much that the Father could look at the Son and say, you're a spitting image of me, I will give you my name as I exalt you to my right hand. It's the same Christology. It's the same emphasis. And again, this is not some Nicene creed type Son of God, full-blown, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. It's none of that. The focus is on the filial relationship between the Son and the Father. Excuse me. This leads to the awareness that the conflict of the Gospel of Mark, which opens up with this just one story after another about conflict, plays a major role, especially when we get to the Passion narrative from chapters 11 through 15, where there again, at the beginning and at the end of the gospel, is conflict, 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 and sandwiched in between the parables chapter 4 all the way through the chapter 10 is a section that just shows incredible misunderstanding. Misunderstanding so great that even Mark records Jesus' family thought he was a bit bonkers and needed to be committed to the nearest asylum. The disciples misunderstanding his messiahship. So we have conflict that sandwiches misunderstanding. There's conflict because there is misunderstanding. There's conflict because there are expectations that Jesus did not fulfill. Are you with me on this? Okay, good. So this is how Mark is understanding this whole business of the life of Jesus. It is a story about conflict, but it's not simply about conflict with authority. It's conflict with religious authority, but it's also conflict with spiritual authority, which is why in Mark's gospel, there is a cosmological emphasis, or as Joel Marcus puts it in his commentary on Mark, Mark's story is about a cosmic battle. This is Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, cosmic battle. That is, Jesus is this figure who's now caught between light and darkness, trying to be the figure that is going to be the conqueror of darkness. It is a cosmic battle. I will read you a small piece from Marcus's, by the way, an excellent commentary on Mark is the Anchor Bible Joel Marcus commentary. He says, Mark has a cosmic apocalyptic eschatology characterized by the notion that the earth is in subjection to cosmic forces of evil, which human beings are helpless to combat through their own efforts, and the only hope for them is an eschatological act of God that will utterly transform the conditions of human existence and defeat the oppressive powers. This description fits Mark's narrative perfectly. And to be sure, we find running through the Gospel of Mark this battle against the Satan and the demonic realm. Now, we're not going to go into all of that. If you want to know what I think about it, you can go read my ebook on Satan. But what's key in this for us is the recognition that the religious authorities and the demonic authorities are perceived as the same. That is, just like the Apostle Paul uses the term principalities and powers to refer to the demonic realm as well as to governance institutions like the state, so Mark is perceiving Jesus' battle on both levels. And both levels are connected. It is a cosmic battle. And as I mentioned before, that cosmic battle takes its denouement in Mark in the temple. It's the temple narrative that functions for the Gospel of Mark as this hermeneutic lens by which to understand all conflict, because it's in the temple itself where Jesus, who is this, quote, messianic figure, will reject the system of sacrifice in the temple just as he has broken a number of very important Jewish laws throughout the Gospel of Mark, eating grain on the Sabbath, healing on the Sabbath, these kinds of things, Jesus will come into conflict in both realms in the temple. It is both the spiritual, demonic realm and the realm of sacrificial religion that are being attacked. Now, thankfully, from a Girardian perspective, it's very easy to understand what's happening in that action in the temple on an anthropological level in the critique of sacrifice, but it's also easy to understand what's happening as Jesus is breaking down the category of the demonic. He's deconstructing it. He's eliminating it from the equation. By eliminating sacrifice, he eliminates the Satan from the equation. You can only have a doctrine of hell or a doctrine of sacrifice if you have a view that God is violent. If you don't have that view, which Jesus did not have, then the temple, which should have been a house of prayer for all peoples, nations, has instead become a small religious institution that guarantees the prosperity of one group of people. So Hamilton Kelly, I didn't put my page number that I wanted to write on this. That was really dumb. Okay. Hamilton Kelly observes, with regard to the Gospel of Mark, and we haven't talked about its date yet, but what we're going to do is talk about its date in a moment. He observes, Jesus stands aloof from revolution because counter-violence is as much a function of the mimetic scapegoating mechanism as established violence, and one cannot fight the devil with his own weapons. For Hamilton Kelly, where Jesus could have taken on a revolution, taken on the title of a Davidic warrior Messiah, redeemed all the house of Israel, fulfilled all the promises that were made to Israel about the sending of a Davidic warrior figure. Jesus could have done that, but had he done that, he would have simply been part of the mechanism. And so the destruction of the temple in Mark is a focal point. And this has led Joel Marcus and many others to make this simple case. The Gospel of Mark was written sometime after Rome began her incursion into Israel in 66 and the final destruction of the temple in 70. That is, the writer of the Gospel of Mark is a Jewish Christian. And now in this tradition of his, he has these sayings of Jesus about the end of the destruction of the temple. And these sayings of Jesus, which were 30 years ago, are now coming true. He's watching it happen. It's an apocalyptic event. If Rome destroys the temple, what's left of Judaism? I mean, we've already talked about how after the destruction of the temple, Judaism had to reconstitute as a new form without a temple. And it became very Torah-centered. But it's the destruction of the temple that creates the possibility of Mark seeing this larger battle being played out, not simply between Rome and Israel, but between Jesus and the cosmic powers. So the destruction of the temple for the writer of the Gospel of Mark was the end of an era. Something had fundamentally changed, and that which had fundamentally changed had already occurred in the death of Jesus. This, the writer is recognizing. The temple, the destruction of the temple, is simply a consequence of what happens when a community of people refuses the message of nonviolence and a nonviolent God, and instead chooses violence and a sacrificial God. The end result will always be the destruction of that religion. I wasn't going to say this on the recording. It's something we can talk about. But when Luke records that the end of time will be when the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled, one has to wonder if we aren't now at that point, and if it's not Christendom's turn to be judged. Are you with me? I think we can almost draw an analogy across from this. Okay. What is it exactly Jesus is doing to create conflict? He's crossing boundaries. There's an excellent essay by David Rhodes in a book called Mark and Method that's edited by Anderson and Moore, Stephen Moore. And what Rhodes notes is, oh man, I've got my, there it is. No, I messed the page up on the, okay. Rhodes notes that there are three types of boundaries that Jesus crosses, and these are in order of importance. The first are the social boundaries of groups and cultures. So social boundaries include for Jesus' contemporaries certain halakha, laws that have to be obeyed. You can't do certain types of work on the Sabbath, these kinds of things. He violates those boundaries. He violates bodily boundaries. He touches lepers, unclean persons. What's the problem with that? If Jesus touches a leper, Jesus is clean, the leper is unclean. And the leper is healed. Is Jesus clean or unclean? And that provides a real problem. Because if Jesus touches a leper and the leper becomes clean, then if Jesus is unclean, if anybody gets near him, they're going to have certain degrees of uncleanness, and they're not going to be able to go attend their fellows with their meals. But the third boundary Jesus transgresses is the cosmological boundary that people project through their belief systems about God and the world. And I found that an absolutely spot-on statement, because if Jesus violates the cosmological boundary that people project through their belief systems about God and the world, it's essentially making the same claim that Barth makes or Girard makes, or I've been making all along, that when God comes into our systems, it is a non-violent God coming into a system of religious thinking that can only think in terms of violent deities. How does a non-violent God manifest God's self when humans are only capable of thinking about Janus-faced or dark deities? Secondly, and as a corollary, how does Jesus come and claim to be the agent of God without leading people to think in any way, shape, or form that he is a violent, messianic, Davidic king, warrior type Messiah? How does he do that? And those two questions are at the heart of this massive conflict. And it's the answer to those questions that gets us out of there. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the revealer of this God who is patient and kind and generous and healing, loving, nurturing, hospitable, all of the things that we see in him and his life and his ministry. So if we have religion and revelation in a dialectic pair, one of, if we have law and gospel, and religion is law and revelation is gospel, we can now add a third category to this, the demonic and the heavenly. That is, the conflict that exists is not simply between religion and revelation and between law and gospel, but it's also a conflict between God and the Satan. And if the Satan is nothing more than our spirituality that we have turned into darkness, and that is, the Satan is anthropological but spiritual at the same time, God didn't create the Satan. This is a direct contradiction of the Enoch view of the devil. We did. We are the Satan. And if that's the case, it makes absolute sense that as religion comes into revelation, violence into nonviolence, gospel into law, so also as the heavenly comes into the demonic or the satanic, we are dealing with fundamentally the same phenomenon: light coming into darkness, illuminating the darkness, and clarifying things. That, to me, is important. That's what Mark gives us. That's what Mark brings to the table, is the awareness that Jesus is doing battle on two levels that are interconnected at the same time. And this has implications for today. We can discuss that in the discussion time. If I don't move on, I will never get to Luke. One of the other things that becomes important, Mark is the first written gospel. Matthew and Luke will, I'm working with a hypothesis here that Mark is the first gospel. Matthew and Luke will redact Mark. They'll edit Mark. They'll use Mark. One of the most interesting things is in Mark, we don't have a conflict between Jesus and Moses, like we might expect, like we do find in Matthew, like we do find in Luke, like we do find in Paul, like we do find in the fourth gospel. The reason for this, I think, is that as this is a little teeny book called Hebrew Gospel, and it's by Wolfgang Roth. And in this book, what Roth shows is that Mark has structured the story of Jesus along the same lines as the Elijah-Elisha narratives. That is, Mark, as the first gospel writer, is trying to show that the two great prophets of Israel, Elijah and Elisha, or Elihu and Elisha, however you want to say these names, these prophets, this most singular, biggest prophets in Israel's history, Jesus is greater than them. And the Markan gospel then is a reframing of this prophetic narrative found in the Samuel King's Chronicles tradition. But it's Luke and Matthew that come along a decade later or so, and will now post destruction of the temple, where they're reconfiguring their relationship to Judaism. The Jewish Christians are reconfiguring their relationship to Judaism. Christianity is trying to figure out its relationship to Judaism. When the destruction of the temple happens, it's the Jews and Jewish Christianity which are wiped out. Doesn't affect the Gentile Christians or the Hellenistic Christians, just the Jewish ones. So when Roth brings up Elijah and Elisha, he's saying Jesus is greater than these figures, this apocalyptic figure that will come again. Remember, Elijah was the one predicted to come again in Jewish tradition. He's the major figure predicted to come again. Jesus is framed within that framework, but for Mark and Luke, post-temple, and John, it has now become Jesus and Moses. Now there's a chart I want to show you here. Share. And I got to go to this one here. I will open this up. Can you all see this? Just nod your heads. I've got, okay. This is from David Mosner's book, Lord of the Banquet. For my money, still one of the best books out there on Luke, even though it's about 25 years old. Just absolutely phenomenal. But what he does in this is he shows how the central section of the Gospel of Luke, what's known as the travel log, which begins in 951 and goes through chapter 18, around verse 10. It's a middle section. And Jesus starts out, sets his face like a flint to Jerusalem, and zoom, just make a straight shot there, all the way down to chapter 18, where he's in Jerusalem, and then we have the events of the last week of Jesus' life. He shows that running throughout this travel narrative is a fourfold theme that comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And it expresses a view of Israelite history that can be found in Josephus, it can be found in the Qumran scrolls, and it can be found in other Jewish literature. Namely, that the Israelites were a stiff-necked people like their fathers, that Jesus was sent to mediate the will of God, to instruct, to admonish, and to warn repentance, that this generation rejects Jesus, the prophet, like Moses, and kills him. And D, this is the piece that is a little bothersome to me. God will rain destruction on the whole crooked nation. That is Mosner's thesis about this prophet like Moses, the rejected prophet like Moses. Matthew, on the other hand, is going to turn Jesus into a new Moses, that is a greater than Moses, but not one that rejects Moses, but Moses 2.0. And so Matthew has 5 discourses in his Gospels, perhaps reflecting the 5 books of Torah. Matthew has Jesus in his Gospel affirming what you and I would call the infallibility or inerrancy of the Jewish texts. Matthew has Jesus obeying the law, not breaking the law. And where Jesus is in contention with the Pharisees, it has not to do with Torah itself, but rather with the traditions or the interpretations that the Pharisees are putting on people, unlike Mark and Luke, where Jesus is actually, or John, where Jesus is actually breaking Torah, or at least Torah as it's interpreted in his time. The second thing I want to show you, let me get out of that, is this chart. Again, this is Luke. This comes from the book Where the Eagles Are Gathered by Stephen Bridge. It's a monograph, a doctoral dissertation. He notices that in the 3 sections of Luke's eschatology, the one, Luke 17, which is in that travel narrative, as well as Luke 21, which is a revision of Mark 13, the little apocalypse, there is a structure. There is the warning of an approaching eschaton. There is universal destruction. There is the revelation of the Son of Man. The elect are evacuated. There's your rapture. There's evacuation prior to judgment. Get out of Jerusalem. And then there's this gathering of the saints, as it were. And that's the frame of eschatology for Luke. And you can see where the fundamentalists get it, can't you? I mean, it's kind of right there. That's their frame of eschatology. But if Jesus is a prophet like Moses, a rejected prophet like Moses, and if in fact Mosner is correct to note this Deuteronomic thing, is the judgment that's brought, is Mosner right? Is Mosner right to call it God's judgment? There is an interesting thing here, and it's the same thing that happens in Paul. In Luke 21, for example, let me read you Luke 21, one verse out of that. Jesus says, okay, in Luke 21, verse 23, alas for those who are with child, and for those who give suck in those days. For great distress shall be upon the earth, and wrath upon this people. It doesn't say wrath of God. We've seen in Paul's writings that Paul talks about the coming wrath, but it's not the wrath of God. Wrath is orge. We get orgy from it, we get anger from it. Orgy and anger both express disorder, chaos. That's the coming wrath. That's what's coming is chaos and disorder. Okay? For some reason, the scholars, when they see the word wrath, they just assume that it belongs to God. And I don't think it does. I don't think we have to read it that way. And so we can ameliorate some of this more fundamentalist type eschatology, this Enochic eschatology, by recognizing that if there is judgment, it is a judgment on religion and the satanic. Now, Paul says the same thing. They were both crucified on the cross. And a cruciform view, which we find in Luke and in Mark and in John, Matthew and Paul, this, even the Revelator, this cruciform view that is that Jesus brought down the principalities and powers. When they tried to bring him down, he took them with it, lies at the heart of the Christologies of Mark and Luke, as well as Paul and John, not Matthew so much. And furthermore, that we can then stipulate that if we are going to follow the synoptic writers or the gospel writers, we have to reckon with this fact that conflict is everywhere written all over the life of Jesus. Even in Matthew's gospel, it begins with Herod seeking the baby Jesus' life. Matthew's whole birth narrative is a conflict narrative. Luke's birth narrative reflects this cosmological conflict that at the end of time, the rich will be poor, the poor will be rich, everything will be reversed. There's that reversal eschatology. And Jesus also seems to have that. And there is a judgment in the gospel tradition. There is a judgment in Jesus' tradition. But it is not the judgment of God. It is the judgment that we bring down on our own heads. If God is nonviolent, if Jesus is nonviolent, if there is no end-time eschatological wrath, then the only way to understand the destruction of Jerusalem is not through the lens of God's judging Israel, but through the lens of Israel receiving the just deserts of her religious orientation up to that time. Now, it's after that time, after the destruction of the temple, when you move into the 2nd century and on, Judaism is abandoned apocalyptic as a way of thinking. They won't have anything the rabbis will have nothing to do with it. All through Mishnah, Talmud, even into modern Judaism, apocalyptic is not a category in Judaism. It is a dominant category in Christianity. The thing that Christians don't want to recognize is that the same thing is happening today. We are at the end of these things, and there is a judgment coming upon Christendom. I don't know what it's going to look like. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but it's coming. And if the Christologies of the Gospels tell us anything, they tell us that those of us who are here bearing witness to that are going to experience this. As some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, "As for these things which you see, the days will come when there shall not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And they said, "Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign this is about to take place?" "Take heed, you're not led astray," he said. "Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he, the time is at hand.' Don't go after them. When you hear of wars and tumults, don't be terrified. This must take place first, but the end will not be at once. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, in various places famines and pestilence, disease. There will be terrors and great signs in the sky. But before all this, before all of this, are you ready? The first sign of the end. But before all of this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to synagogues and prisons and churches. And you will be brought before kings and governors and elders and pastors and theologians for my name's sake. This will be a time for you to bear testimony." I want to suggest to you that's where we're at today. And I will stop the share. Whoops.